Monsters belong in cages. The problem is keeping them there. HartMeyer was built for the worst of them. Killers, things that shouldn't walk free. But when they locked a real monster inside and thought the walls would hold, they turned a prison into a slaughterhouse. By the time I got there, the place was already lost. The cells were open, the screams had stopped, and something hungry was still moving in the dark. HartMeyer sat in the middle of nowhere, buried in the dead heart of a Maine winter. A place built for men who weren't meant to be found again. No roads led through, only two. The trees surrounding it stood gnarled and frozen, their skeletal branches weighed down by ice, forming a jagged wall against the wind. The drive up was quiet, too quiet. No radio chatter from the guards, no visible patrols on the walls, just the low hum of the floodlights struggling against the snowstorm. I pulled up to the front gate and rolled the window down, letting in the sharp bite of the cold. The guard in the booth barely looked at me before hitting the release. No ID check, no words, just the slow groan of the steel doors grinding open. That was the first warning. The second came as soon as I stepped out of the truck. The second gate, the inner gate, was already open. HartMeyer had layers of security, redundancies built on redundancies, lock protocols, armed escorts. No one got past the second gate without clearance, but there it was, yawning open like a mouth, like someone had run out in a hurry. The air inside was heavy, not just with the cold, but with something deeper, a stillness that prisons weren't supposed to have. No distant footfalls of patrolling guards, no echoing voices from cell blocks. Nothing. A single guard stood near the entry hall, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his face pale under the harsh fluorescence. He wasn't watching the cameras, wasn't at his post, just staring at the floor. His name tag read Holt. "You're too late," he muttered. I stopped in front of him. "Tell me anyway." He swallowed, shifting his weight like he was standing on unsteady ground. They didn't just bring him in. He was dropped off. No paperwork, no charges, just two federal-looking types in dark suits who said, "Lock him up and keep him there." Warden asked who he was. They just said, "Not your problem." Next morning, he changed, killed two guards before we locked him down in Delta Block. Should have put a bullet in him right then. Holt let out a dry, bitter laugh. Yeah, Warden thought the same. Ordered Delta Block cleared and locked down. Leave him in there. Let him rot. And now, his fingers twitched against the strap of his rifle. We lost contact with Delta an hour ago. Doors unlocked, power flickered, then the screaming started. His voice got lower. Now, we don't hear anything at all. A bad sign. The only thing worse than hearing the screams was when they stopped. I glanced past him, deeper into the prison. The air had weight now, thick like a held breath. The kind of silence that only came before something went very, very wrong. I adjusted the strap of my rifle and started walking. Holt didn't follow. HartMeyer was a long facility built in layers. You passed through general population first, rows of stacked cells, thick metal bars, the stink of old sweat and regret embedded in the walls. Solitary was next, where the real animals were kept, and at the very back, behind reinforced steel, lay Delta Block. That's where they'd put him. The deeper I went, the worse it got. The emergency lights flickered, casting the hallways in slow, rhythmic shadows. The cameras hung loose from their mounts, wires severed, claw marks raked across the walls, deep, jagged furrows carved into the metal, like something had tested its strength against the prison itself. Then came the smell. Not just rot, something older, wetter, like damp fur and the sharp metallic tang of ozone before a storm. I stopped at the first body, a guard slumped against a toppled desk, eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. His radio was still hissing static. His sidearm was untouched in its holster. Not a fight, a slaughter. A few steps later, another, inmate this time. The door to his cell was bent outward, hinges twisted. His body lay half in, half out, like he'd been dragged through. No blood, no signs of a struggle, just something wrong with the way his limbs bent, like the last thing he'd seen had been too much for his mind to handle. I kept moving. Then a sound. Not a growl, not a howl, something slower, breathing. It came from the corridor ahead, past the next set of bars. I froze. The emergency lights flickered, and for a split second, I saw it. A shape, massive, too big for a man. It turned toward me, and two sapphire eyes caught the light. A low, rumbling breath rolled through the hall. Not an animal, not a prisoner, something else. The hunt had already begun. For a moment, neither of us moved. The emergency lights buzzed overhead, flickering in an erratic rhythm, casting long, jagged shadows along the corridor. The thing ahead of me, too big, too still, watched with its glowing sapphire eyes, breath rolling out in slow, measured waves. The sound of it was thick, deep, something between a growl and a rumble. Then the lights flickered again, and it was gone, not in a burst of movement, not in a lunge, just gone, like a breath of wind slipping through cracks in the walls. The silence left behind was worse. I exhaled, adjusting my grip on the rifle. The air had gone heavy, pressing against my skin, filling the spaces between the iron bars, thick with the scent of damp fur and something else, earthy, primal, unnatural. This wasn't an animal, wasn't human anymore either. It had been something in between, but whatever lines existed between man and monster had long since snapped. I stepped forward. The bars separating me from Delta Block were twisted, the metal warped outward, as if something had forced its way through instead of out. I reached for the heavy door, but it was already loose on its hinges. I pressed forward, the hinges groaning as it drifted open under its own weight. Inside, Delta was dead. No voices, no movement, just the long, dark stretch of abandoned cells. The prisoners were missing, all except one. A man sat on the floor inside cell 24, knees tucked to his chest, rocking slightly. His head was shaved, a prison tattoo crawling up his neck like ivy. His face was wrong, not afraid, not blank, but somewhere in between, frozen in a trance. I stopped outside the bars. Where is everyone? His eyes lifted to me, slow, unfocused. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. He swallowed, blinking hard, like he was dragging himself out of deep water. Then, in a breathless rasp, he muttered, "Gone." Something about the word chilled me, more than the cold. Gone where? I pressed. His fingers twitched, hands trembling against his jumpsuit. Under. That was all he said. I turned from him and looked down the corridor. The other cells stood open, empty, their doors bent outward, as if their occupants had walked out willingly. The air smelled of sweat, of damp stone and something musky, animal-like. There were scratches along the floor, leading toward the far end of the block, disappearing into the darkness. I followed them. The deeper I went, the worse it got. The walls bore long gouges, deep like something had tested its strength against them. Overturned bunks, shattered toilet basins, a guard's baton snapped in two and left discarded in the middle of the hall. The smell thickened, the silence deepened, and then a wet, rhythmic clicking noise somewhere up ahead. Slow, deliberate. It echoed softly down the hall, reverberating against the metal walls. I raised my rifle and moved carefully, footfalls soundless on the cold concrete. I passed an abandoned workstation, its security monitors shattered, flickering static behind cracked glass. Then I saw it. At the very end of the corridor, cell 32. Something moved inside. The emergency lights flickered again, and for half a second I caught a glimpse, a shape hunched in the shadows, something crouched over, shifting. The clicking stopped. I stepped closer. The shape moved slightly, and the dim light caught two bare feet, pale, motionless. The legs attached to them were slack, bent awkwardly, no tension left in the muscles. A prisoner, or what was left of one. His head lolled to the side, mouth slightly open, but his eyes were wide, staring, seeing nothing. And still, something was eating. The thing hunched over him stirred. Slowly, a shape lifted from the corpse, shifting like wet, living darkness. It wasn't the prisoner breathing. It was the thing that had been feasting. I didn't hesitate. My rifle roared to life, the muzzle flash searing through the darkness. The first bullet hit the thing square in the chest, sending it reeling backward. The second shot found its mark just as the lights cut out completely, plunging Delta Block into absolute black. In the dark, I heard it snarl, not in pain, not in fear, in rage. Then the light stuttered back to life, and I saw nothing but an empty cell. The body was still there, but the monster was gone. The shots still rang in my ears as I stepped back from the empty cell, rifle raised, scanning the dim corridor. The silence had changed. Before it had been waiting. Now it was watching. The air smelled of cold stone and something animalistic, thick with the damp electric charge of something unnatural moving just beyond sight. I turned sharply, checking the corridor behind me. Nothing. But it was out there now, somewhere in the prison, slipping between the blind spots like smoke through a cracked door. The lights above flickered again. Then the alarms began to scream. A sudden mechanical wail tore through the prison, a rising, urgent pulse that set my nerves on edge. The security system had triggered, not manually, automatically. The cell doors were opening. HartMeyer was failing. A burst of static crackled through the emergency speakers, the garbled voice of the central control room trying, and failing, to override the lockdown. Containment breach. All units respond. Sector Delta compromised. Security override. System failure. Then a sudden pop, and the lights died completely. I exhaled through my nose. No power, no doors, no walls. The monsters weren't locked up anymore, and they weren't alone. The first scream came from Block C. Not close, but not far enough. I turned and moved quickly, boots soundless on the concrete as I pushed toward the nearest stairwell. The emergency exit signs flickered dim green, casting eerie shadows against the walls. Then the second scream hit. Closer. The scent of fear bled through the corridors, thick and sour. Someone was still alive. Someone was still running. Then, pounding footsteps. Not human, heavy, 4-beat rhythm, claws scraping against concrete. Something was chasing. I broke into a sprint. The stairwell loomed ahead, a dark maw yawning open into deeper shadows. I shoved through the metal door and moved quickly down, past one floor, then another, the sound of movement growing louder behind me. Then I saw it, an open hallway, flickering red emergency lights, revealing a guard running full tilt, his boots pounding against the floor, eyes wide with blind terror. Behind him, something massive, something fast. The werewolf came into view all at once, launching around the corner on all fours, its body sleek with muscle, its limbs too long for its size. Sapphire eyes burned through the darkness, locked onto its prey. I didn't hesitate. I lifted the rifle and fired. The first shot hit just behind its ribs, stopping at mid-stride. It snapped its head toward me, eyes flaring, but the second shot came before it could react, striking square in the shoulder. The creature reeled, not in pain, but frustration, like swatting away a fly. It turned toward me fully, lips peeling back over razor-edged fangs, and let out a sound that made the walls tremble, half snarl, half laughter. Then it lunged. I dropped low as it crashed forward, claws sweeping just past my head, slamming into the concrete wall, hard enough to crack it. I rolled and came up firing, unloading 3 more shots, aiming for center mass. The bullets slowed it, but they didn't stop it. It snarled, shaking its massive head, then lunged again. I barely dodged in time, slamming my shoulder into a metal door, bursting into another corridor. The prison was falling apart around me. More screams, more doors opening, more things moving in the dark. HartMeyer wasn't just a prison anymore. It was a hunting ground. I pressed forward, cutting through an abandoned medical bay. The overhead lamps flickered erratically, casting shifting shapes against the walls. A row of overturned gurneys lay scattered across the floor, papers still drifting in the artificial breeze of the broken ventilation system. Then I saw them, shadows moving beyond the glass, figures shifting unnaturally. Not werewolves, prisoners. They stepped into the flickering light, faces slack, eyes vacant. Their bodies twitched, movements jerky and wrong, like marionettes with tangled strings. Something was still in them, changing them. One of them, a man in a torn jumpsuit, twitched his head toward me, sniffing the air. His fingers flexed, nails blackened at the tips. Not quite human anymore. Not quite werewolf yet. I exhaled slowly. Fuck. Then he lunged. I pulled the trigger. The bullet struck center mass, but he didn't stop. Didn't even stagger. His mouth split into a grin, too wide, too full of teeth. I put the second shot through his skull. This time he dropped. The others stood still for half a second, then charged. I didn't stay to fight. I moved fast out of the medical bay and back into the maze of hallways, stepping over bodies that hadn't gotten back up yet. This wasn't just a werewolf outbreak anymore. The infection was changing. The prison was breaking apart. Not physically. HartMeyer was built to last, but the thin divide between man and monster had cracked open. I had seen outbreaks before, but nothing like this. The halls groaned under the weight of something moving above me. The emergency lights sputtered, throwing jagged shadows that danced along the walls. Somewhere in the distance, metal twisted, not a door opening, but something much larger bending. The air was thick, heavy, oppressive. And then I heard it. A sound I had been expecting but dreading all the same. The slow, rhythmic clicking of claws on stone. Not one set, multiple. I exhaled through my teeth, tightening my grip on the rifle. If I stopped moving, I'd die. If I went the wrong way, I'd die. HartMeyer was a hunting ground now, and I wasn't the only prey left. I moved carefully, cutting through the remnants of a destroyed guard station. The desks had been torn apart, paperwork scattered like dried leaves in the wind. A radio sat overturned on the floor, speaker cracked, still hissing static. Then, through the distortion, I heard a voice. Anyone still alive? Repeat. Any officers in Block D? Report. We're falling back to the signal cut out. I exhaled sharply. Someone was still out there. I grabbed the radio, adjusting the dial. Who's left? Silence. Then, faintly, you need to get out of there. Before I could answer, a loud crash echoed down the corridor behind me. I turned sharply, rifle raised. The metal bars of the cell doors ahead were warped, bent outward, as if something had squeezed through, even though the gaps were too narrow for anything that size to slip past. I moved forward, step by step. The smell was worse here. Pungent, damp, like wet fur, left out in the sun too long. Then I saw it. Cell 47. Something moved inside. At first, I thought it was another prisoner, until I noticed the way the shadows around it didn't sit right. Then the light flickered, and I saw the truth. A werewolf crouched in the corner of the cell. Its body was too large for the space, muscles coiled like a predator about to spring. Its breath rose in slow, deliberate waves, long claws flexing against the stone floor. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the prisoner in front of it. He was still sitting upright, back pressed against the wall, mouth slightly open. But he was long past dead, and the werewolf was still eating. The thing tore off another strip of flesh, slow, unhurried, chewing with an almost methodical patience. Like it wasn't eating for hunger, like it was eating for control. I barely had a second to react before it lifted its head and looked at me. Not with animal hunger, with awareness. A challenge. The moment stretched thin. The emergency light flickered again. Then the werewolf moved. A blur of motion, speed, power, too fast for something that size. It lunged forward, smashing through the cell bars like they were nothing, claws outstretched. I fired. The shot hit it square in the chest, but it didn't slow down. I dove back, slamming into the corridor wall just as the werewolf's claws ripped through the space I'd been standing in. Sparks erupted as its strike carved across the concrete, leaving deep, jagged furrows. I fired again. This time it staggered, not from pain, but from the impact. The thing grinned, the snarl of something that understood the game we were playing. Then it lunged again. I rolled, barely dodging as its claws slammed into the floor, cracking the tile beneath us. My rifle kicked hard in my hands as I fired again, aiming for the head. The bullet hit home. The werewolf collapsed mid-motion, skidding across the floor and slamming into the cell wall with a bone-shaking thud. Silence. I exhaled, rifle still raised, watching for any sign of movement. None. It was down. For now. I turned my attention back to the dead prisoner. His eyes were still open, staring, unseeing. But his mouth was moving. The words were silent, lips forming something too faint to hear. I stepped closer, leaned in. His final whisper reached my ears like a dying breath. It's not alone. The hairs on the back of my neck rose. Then the corridor behind me erupted in howls. I had just made a very big mistake. The howls came from everywhere, deep, reverberating, filling the corridors with a sound that made the walls feel smaller, the air heavier. Not a single beast, not even two, dozens. HartMeyer was lost. And I was still inside it. I exhaled slowly, adjusting my rifle. I had minutes, seconds before the hunt reached me. If I hesitated, I'd end up like the prisoners, like the guards, like the thing still sitting against the wall, dead lips moving with a message that had come too late. It's not alone. I moved. I cut through the maze of corridors, stepping over bodies that hadn't gotten back up yet. The emergency lights sputtered, their dim glow barely enough to see. The stink of fur and sweat filled the air, thick with something else, an energy, a charge. The werewolves weren't just hunting, they were waiting. This wasn't random carnage. The cells had opened deliberately. The prisoners had walked out. The beasts had let them. And the change was still spreading. The infection hadn't come from a single werewolf. It had started before that. Something deeper, something worse. And now, HartMeyer had become a breeding ground. I needed to end this. I reached the control room just as the next set of doors burst open behind me. I turned sharply, rifle up. A shape lunged from the shadows. Not a werewolf, but something between. A prisoner caught halfway through the change, his body twitching, twisting, limbs stretching in ways that shouldn't be possible. His face was still mostly human, but his teeth were already growing too long for his mouth. I fired. The shot took him in the throat. He collapsed, gasping, eyes wide with something I wasn't sure was fear or relief. Then I turned and slammed my hand against the override panel. The lockdown engaged immediately. The prison's final failsafe. HartMeyer wasn't meant to hold men, it was meant to bury them. The power grid flared back to life, the security system activated, and deep in the bowels of the facility, the containment protocol triggered. The doors sealed, the vents shut, and the incinerators roared to life. The howls turned to screams from the hallways, from the lower blocks, from the creatures that had thought they had won. The old warden had said it once, HartMeyer was built for monsters, but not to hold them, to destroy them. I turned away from the control panel as the first traces of smoke began to creep through the vents. The metal doors locked, reinforced barriers dropping into place as the fire spread through the lower levels. The hunt was over, and the hunt had lost. I barely made it out before the flames consumed Delta Block. The emergency exit groaned as I pushed through, stepping out into the blizzard, cold air biting against my skin. Behind me, the prison burned from the inside out, smoke curling into the night sky. I turned back, watching as the floodlights flickered one last time. The howls were gone. The monsters were gone. The job was done, for now. I stood at the edge of the tree line, watching the prison burn. Behind me, something shifted. I turned. Beyond the trees, past the reach of the fire's glow, something watched me back. Not a werewolf. Something else. A reminder that monsters didn't just belong in cages. They belonged in the dark. And the dark is always waiting.